There are some people who only need to appear, and you immediately know they are not like anyone else. And Gary Busey was one of them. He didn't just act, he exploded. He didn't just speak. He seemed to spill beyond every boundary. Those eyes, they didn't look like an actor playing a role. They looked like something inside that could not be contained. There was a time when Hollywood looked at him and saw a legend in the making. An Oscar nomination, performances that held people captive, a path that seemed already written. Everything was going exactly as it should, until it wasn't anymore. A crash in 1988, an impact that nearly took his life. And after that, strange words, unpredictable behavior, appearances. That left the world confused. He was still there, but something had changed. So what really happened to Gary Busey? Was it an accident that shattered everything, or was it a truth Hollywood never wanted to reveal? In 1944, in Texas, a place known for strong, straightforward people, Gary Busey was born. But he was never a normal part of any mold. From an early age, he wasn't the kind of person people looked at and thought, this will be a star. No classic Hollywood looks, no calm, controlled presence, no clear path. But there was something that cannot be taught, cannot be manufactured, a force of energy so intense that even he couldn't fully control it. Those who encountered Gary Busey in his youth didn't remember him for stability, but for intensity. He didn't walk into a room, he flooded it. He didn't talk, he poured out his thoughts. He didn't feel emotions, he lived inside them, to the extreme. And that created a paradox from the very beginning. Because in a world like Hollywood, where everything is controlled, calculated, and shaped, someone like Gary Busey was both the greatest asset and the greatest risk. This is not the story of a man who became unusual later. Perhaps it is the story of a person who, from the very start, was never truly within the bounds of normal. And when you look back at his entire journey, maybe the question isn't, what changed Gary Busey? But rather, was he ever truly changed at all? Or was everything we saw later simply his true self, amplified to a point where it could no longer be hidden? Entering Hollywood in the 1970s, Gary Busey was not a name that immediately drew attention. He didn't have the look of a star. He didn't carry the kind of calm that directors could easily control. He wasn't the type of actor Hollywood could shape at will. In a system where everything was standardized, Gary Busey was an outsider. He took small roles, appeared, then disappeared. No scandals, no breakthrough, just a name drifting among hundreds of others. But there was one thing that very few people noticed at the time. He possessed something Hollywood both craved and feared. Real danger. Not the kind of danger written in a script, but the feeling that you never knew what he would do next. And then, that moment came. In 1978, the Buddy Holly story arrived. Gary Busey didn't just play Buddy Holly, he almost became him. Not through perfect technique, not through refined control, but through something raw, more dangerous, more real. He sang as if there were no limits, acted as if there were no safety net, lived in every moment, to the point where the audience no longer saw an actor at all. And Hollywood couldn't ignore it. An Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. A leap from outsider to a name the entire industry had to reconsider. But right here, a paradox began to take shape, because the very thing that brought Gary Busey to the top was not something Hollywood could control. His success didn't come from technique. It came from raw emotion, real, unrestrained. And when an actor cannot be controlled, the question is no longer, is he talented? But rather, how long can we keep him within the limits? Moving into the 1980s and 1990s, Gary Busey was no longer an unfamiliar name. He wasn't an A-list star in the traditional sense, but he became something Hollywood always needs, an element that cannot be replaced. In Lethal Weapon, he didn't just play a villain. He created a sense of real unease, cold eyes, a crooked smile, a silence. That made you unsure what would happen next. That wasn't acting, that was presence. Then came Point Break, where he stood alongside major stars, yet still held onto a uniquely his own energy, and Under Siege, further cementing his image as someone unpredictable, not following rules, not following familiar logic, not like anyone else. Gary Busey gradually became a very specific kind of character. Not a typical villain, but a threat. Without a pattern. People weren't afraid of what he did. They were afraid because they didn't know what he would do. And that was what made him irreplaceable. But if you look deeper, there's something not everyone realized. Gary Busey didn't act those characters. He became them. There was no clear distance between the real man and the role. No safe boundary, no layer of control. He didn't step into the role. He let the role step into him. And for a time, that was his greatest weapon. It made everything feel alive, real, dangerous in the truest sense. But because there was no boundary, there was no stopping point. And when a person can no longer tell where the role ends and where they begin, the very thing that once created success can also become the thing that destroys everything. And perhaps Gary Busey's tragedy did not begin with the accident in 1988. It may have begun in the very moment, when he stopped acting and started living entirely within that chaos. And then that moment came. In 1988, not on a film set, not under the lights of Hollywood, but on a road where everything happened in just a few seconds. Gary Busey was riding a motorcycle, no helmet, a collision, and then everything went dark. His body was thrown onto the pavement. His head struck hard. Brain hemorrhage, severe trauma. This wasn't a serious accident in the way people casually describe. It was a moment where the line between life and death became fragile. He was rushed to the hospital, emergency surgery. There were moments when no one was sure he would survive, but he did. And that is where everything became more complicated. Because sometimes surviving doesn't mean everything returns to what it was. He opened his eyes. He spoke. He returned to the world. But something was no longer the same. Not immediately obvious, not explosive, just subtle changes in the way he spoke, in the way he reacted, in the way he existed. He survived, but he was no longer the same man. From a scientific standpoint, a brain injury is not just a physical wound. It can alter the way a person thinks, the way they control emotions, the way a person understands themselves. And in Gary Busey's case, perhaps it did exactly that. But Hollywood never said it outright. No official statement, no clear conclusion. Only one thing quietly began to unfold. Distance. The roles began to change. The opportunities were no longer the same. No one said why. But in an industry built on controlling image, a person who can no longer fully control themselves becomes a risk. And perhaps this is not just the story of an accident, but the moment. A man was split into two versions. The one who existed before 1988, and the one the world began to see after. The question is, which one was the real man? And will we ever truly know the answer? After the accident, everything did not collapse immediately. There was no moment when the world stopped and said, "He has changed." No, it happened. More slowly, more quietly, and harder to recognize. Interviews began to feel different. Answers no longer followed familiar logic. He spoke more, faster, and sometimes no one truly understood what he was trying to say. His behavior became unpredictable, his emotions unstable. At times he was full of energy, almost explosive. But at others, he lost control in ways no one could foresee. And then the question began to emerge, not in headlines, not in the press, but in the minds of those who had worked with him. Is this the result of the accident or something that had always existed within him? Because if you look back, Gary Busey was never a normal person. From the very beginning, he carried an extreme energy, a way of experiencing the world, unlike most, an emotional intensity, always beyond the safe limit. So perhaps the accident in 1988 didn't create a new man. It simply broke something that had always been there, a layer of control, a social filter that once allowed him to fit into the world around him. And when that filter disappeared, Gary Busey was no longer a version Hollywood could understand, no longer an actor, no longer an image, but a man in his rawest state, uncontrolled, unfiltered, unrestricted. And that is what made everything difficult. Because Hollywood can accept difference, but only when it still falls within predictable limits. Gary Busey no longer did. No one knew what he would say next. No one knew how he would behave. And in an industry built on image and stability, that is not unique. It is a risk. And perhaps that was the moment everything truly began to change. Not because of the accident, not because of scandal, but because Gary Busey was no longer someone Hollywood could control. And when that happens, Hollywood doesn't need to say anything. It doesn't need to make a statement. It only does one thing, very quietly. It begins to walk away. The change did not happen overnight. There was no single failed film that brought everything crashing down. No scandal large enough to end his career. It was simply, the roles began to fade. The offers grew fewer. The major projects no longer called his name. Gary Busey was still appearing, but no longer on the stages that once defined him. Instead, there were reality TV shows, game shows, platforms, where being unusual was no longer a risk, but the content itself. He still spoke, still smiled, still carried that familiar energy. But this time, not to build a character, but to become something else. The public began to see him differently. No longer the Oscar-nominated actor, no longer the terrifying villain of the 80s and 90s, but a strange phenomenon, a person who made people laugh, or feel confused, or unsure of what to feel at all. And that is the paradox, because Hollywood always claims it loves difference. It seeks out those who are unlike anyone else. Strong personalities, unique energy, but only when that difference still remains within controllable limits. Gary Busey no longer existed within those limits. He could not be shaped, could not be predicted, could not be managed in the way the industry required. And when a person no longer fits the system doesn't need to remove them. It only needs to do something far simpler. Stop choosing them. No announcement, no farewell, just a prolonged silence. And within that silence, Gary Busey did not completely disappear. He was still there, but no longer part of the story that Hollywood wanted to tell. Over time, Gary Busey's moments were no longer remembered for his acting, but for their strangeness. Interviews became viral clips. His words made people laugh or feel confused or unsure of how to react. He spoke quickly, spoke a lot, and sometimes as if he were inside a stream of thought only he could understand. His behavior became unpredictable, unscripted, untethered from familiar logic. And that became exactly what made him fit into a new world, the internet, a place where nothing needs to be perfect. Nothing needs to be logical. It only needs to be different enough to capture attention. And Gary Busey became part of that. His expressions were context. His words turned into memes. His moments were no longer stories, but content to be consumed. And that's when a question became impossible to ignore. Is this still a career, or is it a man being turned into entertainment? Because there is a very thin line between being different and being exploited. Gary Busey was once the one in control of the stage, the one who held audiences captive with his talent. But now, he still holds people's attention, just for a different reason. And perhaps this is the hardest part of the story. Not the fall, not the disappearance, but existing in a form you may no longer be able to control. So the question is no longer, how has Gary Busey changed? But are we seeing him as a human being, or just as a moment of entertainment? And if we're honest, are we laughing, or are we witnessing a tragedy? Some stories end with a collapse, a scandal, a failure, a moment when everything shatters before the public's eyes. But Gary Busey's story did not end that way. He still appears, still speaks, still smiles, still carries that familiar energy, the very thing people once couldn't look away from. But something has changed. He is no longer the center, no longer the one the stories revolve around, no longer the name Hollywood needs. He is still there, but no longer in the same place. And that is the hardest part of the change to notice. Because it isn't loud, it isn't clear. There is no single moment where you can say, this is when everything ended. It feels more like a fading, little by little. The roles diminish, the attention fades, the influence fades with it. Not because of one major mistake, not because of a single wrong decision, but simply because the world has moved on to a different story, and Gary Busey is no longer part of that story. This is not a Hollywood-style downfall, not a fall from the peak into the abyss, but a far stranger kind of disappearance. A man who still exists, still present, still seen, but no longer seen the same way. And perhaps that is the hardest thing to accept. Not losing everything in a single moment, but slowly becoming invisible, right before the eyes of the world. When you look back at the entire journey, Gary Busey's story does not resemble anything Hollywood is familiar with. He didn't die in tragedy. He didn't completely disappear from the world. He wasn't destroyed by scandal or a public collapse. He is still here, still speaking, still smiling, still existing in his own way. And yet, this is where a paradox begins to reveal itself. He is still there, but no longer the man the world once knew. Not because he disappeared, but because the image of him has changed. Not in a single moment, but over time, little by little, until no one can pinpoint exactly when that change was truly complete. And perhaps this is the most frightening part. Not losing everything in a single collapse, but still existing, while slowly drifting away from the person you once were. Gary Busey is not the story of failure. He had success. He left a mark. He had moments no one can deny, but what makes his story different is not what he achieved. It is how he changed, and how the world changed the way it sees him. And when the final light fades, perhaps what remains is not fame, not the roles, but a question with no clear answer. What is more terrifying, losing everything in a single moment, or still being there, but no longer being yourself? Leave your thoughts below. And if you want to explore more stories behind the spotlight, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what comes next.